you might contribute to deterrence because you look, frankly, like a tougher target. You make it look like if there is conflict, it will be drawn out and not a quick or easy win.
This is, of course, while Vladimir Putin doubles down on demands for Ukrainian territory ahead of peace talks with the US and Moscow. While that's going on, Europe is considering a completely different approach to Russian aggression: retaliation. The bloc has found itself being bombarded by acts of aggression from Moscow in recent months, including GPS jamming, drones and fighter jet incursions. Is it time for them to fight back with more than just sanctions? Well, here to explain more, Matthew Savill, who's Director of Military Sciences at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. Good evening, Matthew. How are you?
Good evening. Fine, thank you very much.
This is interesting, basically. It is whether we are at the point, as the German Secretary of Defence said, or as the Latvian Foreign Minister said, Russia's constantly testing our limits. How far can we go in retaliation? German Secretary of Defence saying, should we consider now becoming more active ourselves in this area? In other words, should the EU, should European nations really start to consider taking the fight to Russia? What would that look like, though? We've got to consider NATO in this, haven't we?
Yes, yes. And the first thing is that it depends on whether you are talking about a response by individual countries that they coordinate, or something that is more official underneath the banner of a supranational institution like NATO or the EU. I think it is probably long past the time where there was more robust action being taken by countries in Europe. Some of it might be happening already. I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. But the question really here is how much of that is defensive and how much of it is offensive and more disruptive. I think that what it could look like is a stepped up intelligence activity that effectively goes after the tools that the Russians are using to create problems. Allegedly, because of course some of this is intended to be deniable, however implausibly.
Give me some examples, if you can, Matthew, of the kind of activity Russia is carrying out and how enhanced intelligence might help to combat that.
Well, I mean, we have a range of activities that some people call hybrid warfare, although that term might be being misapplied. We would call it unconventional warfare. Some of it would have been in the Cold War known as active measures. But it's a range of activities, some of which are meant to be deniable, that consist of hostile or disruptive actions that are intended to either inflict pain upon adversary countries or at least cause them to reduce their support for Ukraine. And that is everything from alleged sabotage of transport links, flying small drones near civilian airports so that those flights are disrupted. As you mentioned, GPS jamming to interfere with both military and civilian flights. And what we've seen as acts of sabotage across Europe over the past 18 months, aimed particularly at warehouses or other locations where support to Ukraine moves through.
In fact, data shows that Globsec, the Prague-based think tank, calculates there were more than 110 acts of sabotage and attempted attacks carried out in Europe between January and July of this year, mainly in Poland and France, by people with links to Moscow. So we can get an understanding of what this involves. We need to remember, of course, that no European nation and no NATO alliance wants to, well, that is not the point of NATO. They are defensive rather than offensive. But no one wants to take a fight to Russia when they are armed with nuclear weapons, of course.
Of course, but I think the options that are open are on the defensive front, improving our ability to detect and stop this kind of activity. So if you can jam drones or indeed shoot them down or otherwise knock them out of the sky, make it harder for them to actually have any impact, then you waste those attacks and the Russians will, if it's them, ideally essentially be deterred because it's fruitless doing it. Or you might put in place better security measures to identify and stop Russian intelligence officials moving around Europe. Many of them were expelled after the Skripal poisonings. I think offensively, what we might see is something that looks similar in terms of intelligence activity to disrupt, maybe through offensive cyber, maybe through law enforcement action, material and support that comes into Europe to enable these attacks. And critically, for example, as the Russians use more and more proxies, criminals or people who are sometimes unwitting being paid to do this, if there are serious consequences for those people, the Russians might start finding it harder to recruit essentially those kind of people to conduct the attacks or activity, and then they'll have to risk Russian intelligence officials even more and in a hostile environment.
Okay, interesting. Let's talk about France, because as you've mentioned, individual nations can get themselves ready as well. There is work on the home front in each of the European nations, and France announced today that it's going to bring back a limited form of military service, and this is in direct response to growing fears of a confrontation with Russia. This is not just us speaking in theory. This is nations gearing up for a fight, to reduce it down to its simplest term, with Russia. What do you think of what France is doing? This is volunteering, young men and women volunteering for a paid 10 months of military training.
Yes, and there are a number of schemes across Europe of varying different levels of maturity, where countries look at how they mobilize people for defensive purposes or to join the armed forces, make better use of expertise in their societies that will support security. And this French model seems to be the latest. I mean, what I make of this is that France is thinking seriously about, assuming it implements this, how do we boost our level of readiness and preparedness if there is a conflict, not least, and we discussed this at a major conference at RUSI yesterday, if you can demonstrate you have greater depth of resources, of people, of reserves, not only do you improve your resilience, but you might contribute to deterrence because you look, frankly, like a tougher target. You make it look like if there is conflict, it will be drawn out and not a quick or easy win.
And that's such a good point. France has around 200,000 military personnel, currently a further 47,000 reservists. And this new voluntary scheme for military training could or should rise to 50,000. So you're talking around 300,000 in total there, which absolutely dwarfs what we have here in the UK, doesn't it?
It does, although I do know that the French system includes under military spending a lot of functions that we wouldn't necessarily include in our armed forces numbers, like elements of the gendarmerie. But yes, they do maintain larger military forces than the UK. And again, there is a big discussion going on here about how we make use of our reserves, those people who are already on our books, but also people who've left the military, the kind of people with a lot of expertise and experience who would potentially be called up if a major conflict was approaching, or we might seek to use. And then how do we bring in additional expertise from the private sector, not necessarily putting a uniform on them, but bring them in as partners towards military activity? And again, that is about both ensuring you are covering the gaps in your capabilities and knowledge under normal conditions where threats are proliferating, but also demonstrating that you've got a bit more in the tank ahead of anything that might be an extended war.
Vladimir Putin told reporters today he was serious about peace talks mediated by the US with the aim of ending the war in Ukraine. I mean, it's the question really is, can he be trusted? But that's kind of a ridiculous question to ask. Do you think that there is enough intent behind Russia's involvement with these peace negotiations to signify that an end to this conflict might be close, Matthew?
I think it's easy to be cynical and suspicious because the Russians have I think, broken in some form or another pretty much every agreement that they've made, particularly on Ukraine. I think there is interest in Russia over what they can get from these negotiations, because it might be that they are offered something that they weren't necessarily expecting. But the way that they are set up in terms of their industry, their recruitment, and how they're acting on the battlefield, they still seem to be backing themselves to be able to break Ukraine's will to resist, or at the very least make them unviable as a sort of separate economic entity. And the line that they are trying not to cross is for any blame in the breakdown of talks to be transferred across to them. They want to make it look like the Ukrainians are the ones that are being unreasonable. I think the Ukrainians are the ones who want to engage in good faith, but demonstrate that Russia is the party to these negotiations who is being disingenuous.
Matthew, it's always so great to speak to you. Thank you for your wisdom. Matthew Savill, Director of Military Sciences at RUSI. Great to have you on.